former Chief Justice, Patna High Court, Mr. Justice I.A. Ansari Saheb, Soumya Sanjay, and other members of Club of Law students and participants. The Honorable Judge has focused on many important issues at the national level, and it will be my pleasure to focus a few international aspects, particularly in the context of protection of human rights in the globalized world. Um, I want to start with a quotation. Those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. As the ancient proverb goes, if we do not learn lessons from history, we tend to repeat the very same mistakes. Uh, Before we look at the challenges, it is very important to understand the historical context and also appreciate the positive developments. Following horrors of World War I and World War II, including gas chambers, concentration camps, Holocaust, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, and chastened by these terrible, egregious violations, the international community adopted the United Nations Charter and subsequently the International Bill of Rights. If you look at the United Nations Charter preamble, there is a very clear assertion which goes as follows, and I quote: "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person." Unquote. Article 1 of the UN Charter says the purposes of UN are: one, to maintain international peace and security; two, promote social and economic development; and three, and more importantly for our purposes, promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted on 10th December 1948, in its preamble holds inherent dignity and rights as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. It highlights the importance of promotion of universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. It terms UDHR as the common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. It is an authoritative statement of basic rights to which every human being is entitled. UDHR represents a major milestone in human progress, bringing to realization to the UN Charter principle that universal respect for human rights is the common concern of all governments and all peoples. Today, UDHR is accepted almost universally as a gauge by which governments can measure their progress in the protection of human rights. It is invoked constantly in UN General Assembly, Security Council, and other organs. It is quoted in international legal instruments. It is invoked in many national constitutions, which came to independence after UN Charter was adopted. It, UDHR inspired and sometimes became part of many countries' national legislation and has been cited with approval in national courts. The rights set forth in UDHR have been reiterated and affirmed in over 70 international human rights treaties adopted by the UN General Assembly. And they have been incorporated into regional human rights treaties and documents such as the European Convention of Human Rights, the European Social Charter, the African Charter of Human and People's Rights, and the Helsinki Accords. Those who adopted the UDHR did not imagine it to be a legally binding document, but its legal impact is very wide. Over the past 75 years, the UDHR has become a cornerstone of customary international law, and all governments are now bound to apply its principles. UDHR is today available in more than 500 languages, which is a testament to its universal appeal. The declaration is the most translated document in the world. Now, let me discuss the significance of the international human rights law. In the period 1946 to 2006, nearly 6 decades, over 70 legally binding and some 30 odd non binding standards or principles were adopted by the UN General Assembly. International Criminal Court came into existence in 2002 for trying four serious types of crimes, signaling international communities' willingness to move from norm setting or standard setting to enforcement. Today, there exists treaty based and charter based mechanisms to protect and promote human rights. There are nine core international human rights instruments, and India has signed and ratified most of them. Each of these instruments has established a committee of experts to monitor implementation of the treaty provisions by its state parties. Some of the treaties are supplemented by optional protocols dealing with specific concerns. Today, there does not exist any country in the world which has not signed or ratified at least one core human rights treaty. More than two-thirds of the world's countries have signed and ratified the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. If you take up the Women's Convention or CEDAW or the Children's Convention or the CRC, they have a near universal ratification. Today, no country can say that it does not stand for human rights. These are in some positive developments. And now let me turn your attention to the some challenges, and I'll pick a few challenges, and there are of course many which the world faces today. First is the digital challenges. We are living in a digital world. Every minute we are consuming petabytes or zettabytes of data when we use internet for communication, business, or entertainment. Our extreme dependence on these digital technologies has led to new vulnerabilities. There are both positive as well as negative impacts of digital technologies on human rights. I will highlight some negative impacts. Activists question Meta's dubious role in the 2017 ethnic cleansing of Rohingyas in Myanmar. Right to privacy is violated when Pegasus spyware is deployed to tap mobile phones of journalists and human rights defenders. Phone of Paranjay Guha Thakurda, an investigative journalist who was then investigating into the finances of a late prominent industrialist, was hacked into in 2018. The phones of two of the three co-founders of the independent online news outlet The Wire, Siddharth Varadarajan and M.K. Venu, were both infected by Pegasus, with Venu's phone hacked as recently as July 2023. Now, let me turn your attention to another major challenge, which is lethal autonomous weapons. Several countries have conducted research on lethal autonomous weapons and developed them. In fact, if you look at the Russia-Ukraine war or Libya war, they have been deployed in some of these theaters of conflict. These are weapons that independently select and attack targets. They are killer robots, drones, and other such systems. When autonomous weapon systems are used to target people, they raise several serious concerns. As inanimate objects, machines cannot understand the value of human life or the significance of its loss. We simply cannot allow machines to make life and death determinations. In the process of determining whom to kill, autonomous weapon systems boil human targets down to data points. Late Professor Christoph Heinz, the then UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, said, and I quote, to allow machines to determine when and where to use force against humans is to reduce those humans to objects. They become zeros and ones in the digital scopes of weapons which are programmed in advance to release force without the ability to consider whether there is no other way out, without a sufficient level of deliberate human choice about the matter. Unquote. These systems dehumanize the use of force in a dangerous way. There is also the risk of discrimination. Autonomous weapon systems choose whom to engage based on so called target profiles. And these profiles can be criteria such as weight or heat signatures. While such criteria may seem neutral, algorithmic bias in numerous contexts show that whatever the criteria, machines are likely to reflect the biases of their programmers and biases of the society. Use of artificial intelligence in other fields has provided widespread evidence of these risks of bias. To make matters worse, autonomous weapon systems could be programmed with intentionally discriminatory target profiles, such as skin color or beards, to signify young men of military age. During armed conflict, selection of target without meaningful human control poses grave dangers to civilians and other non-combatants, and in the process presents obstacles to compliance with international humanitarian law. For example, it would be difficult for autonomous weapon systems to distinguish between civilians and combatants, as well as between those who are wounded and are surrendering and combatants still fighting. Unlike human soldiers, autonomous weapon systems cannot relate to the people they encounter, and thus may be unable to understand subtle cues like tone of voice or facial expressions that could help them make the distinction. They may thus kill or injure civilians or those who are horse they combat, or those who are not legitimate targets under the laws of war. Autonomous weapon systems face difficulty complying with the rule of proportionality, determining whether expected civilian harm outweighs anticipated military advantage is a subjective test that relies on human judgment at the time of attack and not an algorithm. It is determined by a reasonable commander standard that takes into account criteria such as human reason, past experience, ethical assessments, and common sense. Ladies and gentlemen, let me turn your attention to next major challenge of climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been saying that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying. Its 2022 report contained many alarming findings. Carbon dioxide emissions in 2019 were higher than at any time over the last 2 million years. The sea levels have risen faster in 1900s than any other century prior to that. Changes due to global warming, such as changes in the ice sheets, oceans, and global sea levels, are now irreversible. And these developments have catastrophic consequences for the future of humanity. IPCC Climate Report 2022 key findings are: one, we are set to pass the 1.5-degree threshold by 2040. Humans are the main drivers of climate change. We need to take notice of methane levels. We are close to reaching irreversible tipping points. The main message from IPCC 2023 report is that, and I quote, human society causes climate change. Climate change through hazards, exposure, and vulnerability generate impacts and risks that can surpass limits to adaptation and result in serious losses and damages. Unquote. Climate change is a pressing human rights issue. Climate change must be seen from a human rights perspective. It affects one's right to life, right to food, right to clean drinking water, right to housing, right to livelihood, and many other important rights. Former UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Mr. Philip Alston, has warned that climate change will undo the gains of last 50 years of development, global health, and poverty reduction. He pointed out that while the poor are responsible for a fraction of global emissions, they will bear the brunt of climate change and lack capacity to protect themselves. Terming it as a climate apartheid scenario, he observed that the wealthy will pay to escape overheating, hunger, and conflict, while the have nots or the poor will be left to suffer the adverse consequences of climate change. Thus, climate change is a human rights crisis which has the potential to affect the most vulnerable the hardest. In October 2021, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. The UN General Assembly recognized it in July 2022. These landmark developments strengthen the rights-based approaches towards protection against climate change. They also increase the accountability of states to take steps towards mitigation of the effects of climate change. What was the change in the temperature of Earth in the last 10,000 years? These are not driven by humans, but by slow changes in planet's orbit that affect how it receives energy from the sun. This gradual temperature change, averaging around zero point 0.5 degrees centigrade over the past 10,000 years, provided a stable environment supporting human civilization's development. Paleoclimate record also reveals that the current climatic warning is occurring much more rapidly than past warming events. As the Earth moved out of ice ages over the past million years, the global temperature rose a total of 4 to 7 degrees Celsius over about 5,000 years. In the past century alone, the temperature has climbed 0 0.7 degrees Celsius, roughly 10 times faster than the average rate of ice age recovery warming. We have more carbon dioxide and methane following climate change. It is a human induced change. It does not spare anyone. It is too expensive to mitigate climate change reality. According to some studies, 12 billion tons of plastic is dumped into sea, with India, China being among major culprits. You can imagine the consequences of this dumping of plastic on the world at large. A few years back, 1,600 metric tons of waste was generated in Delhi. Now it could be much more. Every year, we lose 10 million hectares of forest, equivalent to the size of Iceland. 70% of earth and oceans are heating up. Greece recently experienced floods following massive rains. In fact, Greece received 3 years rainfall in 3 days following climate change. You can imagine what will be the consequences of that massive rainfall. There is a 25% loss of biodiversity and soil in Greece. In some pockets of the world, there are water shortages amidst floods. Soil health and freshwater resources are a source of deep concern. We are going to run out of air, water, and life support systems. NASA predicts that large portions of Earth will be uninhabitable in 50 years' time. In our attempt to create well being and economic growth, we have depleted ecological bank. We do not have the luxury of time on our side. Today, a village in India, which was once self sustainable, buys 80% of its needs from outside. The important lesson is that our life is not synchronous, or our life is not in sync with the planet. Rivers, lakes, mountains, birds, animals, plants, and oceans have voices. There is an interdependency of life. We need to hear these voices carefully and pay heed to them, or else we have catastrophes like Joshi Mutt caving in, Teesta floods, Silkiara tunnel, etc. India ranks 7th in the list of countries most vulnerable to climate change. As per the World Air Quality Report, India was home to 11 of the 15 most polluted cities in Central and South Asia in 2021. Poor air quality is the second biggest factor for diseases. The report mapping India's climate vulnerability states that more than 80% of India's population lives in districts which are vulnerable to hydromet disasters of extreme nature. The states in the northeast are the most vulnerable to floods, while those in the south and central part of India are most vulnerable to droughts. India is an environmentally vulnerable position. Climate crisis is looming large. Let me now turn your attention to a third major challenge of genocide in Myanmar and Palestine. As the world celebrates 75th anniversary of UDHR and Genocide Convention, the promise held by these landmark post-war II international instruments lies in tatters. South Africa, as you know, has brought a case against Israel in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, Netherlands, in December 2023, accusing it of having committed genocide in the occupied territories of Palestine. 2 weeks ago, in nearly 3 hours of testimony, lawyers and experts on behalf of South Africa presented evidence arguing that Israel's bombardment of the Gaza Strip, which has now continued for more than 100 days, has gone beyond a war on Hamas and become a war on all 2 million Palestinians besieged in the Gaza Strip. Israel's bombardment of Gaza has killed more than 27,000 people, approximately 1% of the pre war population, according to Gaza's health ministry. Israel's offensive is in response to the October 7 Hamas attack on Israel, in which 1,200 people were killed and more than 240 were taken hostage, according to Israeli officials. The International Court of Justice has found it is plausible that Israel has committed acts that violate the Genocide Convention. In a provisional order delivered by the court's president, Joan Donoghue, the court said Israel must ensure with immediate effect that it forces not commit any of the acts prohibited by the Genocide Convention. The court voted 15-2 on the order that Israel must take all measures in its power to stop anything in relation to genocide in Gaza. By 16 votes to 1, the ICJ voted that Israel needs to take all measures within its powers to prevent and punish those involved with, in, excuse me, inciting genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Also, by a 16-1 vote, the ICJ said that Israel must take immediate and effective measures to ensure the provision of urgently needed humanitarian aid and basic services. The court also ordered Israel to take effective measures to prevent destruction and ensure preservation of any evidence related to the charge of genocide. The court gave Israel 30 days to report back on the measures taken. This is the only second time a state has tried to litigate a charge of genocide against another. In 2019, Gambia took Myanmar to the ICJ, accusing it of a genocide against the Rohingya. In that case, the court approved emergency measures to protect Myanmar's Muslim Rohingya minority, which Myanmar ignored. There are, of course, many more challenges, which include corruption, shrinking of democratic space, press freedom, growing right wing regimes, modern slavery, global hunger, trafficking, women and children across the world, and many more challenges. For reasons of time, I'm not going to go into this detail, but I wish to flag your attention to some of these human rights challenges in a globalizing world. With these few words, I wish to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to share my views. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Over to the